So today we are joined by Rachel Edenfield, who is the founder and CEO of Swell, a preventative mental and relational health platform built to make care radically more accessible. Rachel, a former social worker turned product builder, started by serving one of the toughest communities out there, warfighters and their family. She has since raised 1.7 million to put that same clinically backed self-guided support in anyone's pocket. Rachel, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Great to be
Yeah.
here with you guys.
Good to have you on, Rachel. Looking forward to it.
So one thing to think about as far as an app goes, it's not a case of is there an app for mental health, but can you actually build help for the people that are least likely to ask for it and reach them before the crisis and not after?
Mm.
Yeah, so that's kind of what we're focused on. I think right now in the market, if you know what you want, there's a lot of support for you, right? So if you're like, I'm aware that I have anxiety and I've done some research and I know that meditation could likely help me or grounding techniques could likely help me. There are tons of applications out there that will teach you how to do those things, which is great. But what I found in the company I was with previously, when we were working with warfighters there as well as the early kind of days of Swell, is most people who need help don't like identify themselves as needing it. So oftentimes what happens is like, someone could be having panic attacks kind of on a regular basis, but they wouldn't think that they have anxiety. Like they wouldn't identify themselves as that way. Or what we hear a lot, particularly within the military community, is like, it's so great that we're destigmatizing mental health. It's so great that there's all these things out there. I'm really supportive of mental health resources, but it's like for someone else. It's like this idea we have in our heads that there's always someone out there worse off than we are. And that's kind of who these solutions are for. And so we really, with Swell, focused more on what are the kind of like early signals that people have of some of these issues that we could solve without them having to identify as maybe having a mental health disorder, especially because a lot of times they don't. Like we could be kind of a lot earlier, in that journey for someone. And so we tend to focus a lot on like relationship help, couples arguing, dynamics that couples frequently get stuck in, things like I want to perform at work, but I just can't get motivated. These kind of things that people actually are ready to get help for right now. And then in that process can kind of uncover some other issues that we can provide a lot of like clinical interventions for. So we take a lot of the clinical interventions you would get if you were in session with a therapist, but then we're applying them a lot earlier. So
Mm.
maybe not for someone who's like at that stage, but someone who's maybe 3 years before that, and just kind of struggling with, like motivation. We'll use some like ADHD tactics to like help people initiate tasks, even though that person doesn't need to be diagnosed with ADHD to kind of get those tactics from us through our.
Yeah, so that's interesting because I think myself and most people would consider therapy to be a pretty human experience. So, for you, was there at some point a degree of maybe being uncomfortable about putting like software between person and a therapist, or is that is that the idea? Is there a purpose behind that with what you're doing as well? Like you said, and doing this stuff preventively earlier prior to where they might be at the point of sitting down one on one. Because I think that's what I think of is like if you're looking at it the way you messaged there about tackling some of these things earlier, then it's not so much an idea of replacement. It's more of this is something that helps. This is what gets you to kind of gets you towards the point of in being in therapy. Am I getting that right? Or
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think that any software can replace one-on-one therapy. I think there's definitely apps out there that try, and I'm always a little bit kind of, I guess, concerned when I see things like that. I think in an ideal world, no matter how early you are, no matter if you have a clinical diagnosis or not, I think a lot of people can benefit from a therapeutic relationship with a therapist. But if we just look at the state of the world, that's not possible. Like if we're looking at the United States and we were to take every therapist that holds a license in the United States, and let's just say we made therapy free. Like let's say insurance wasn't a barrier, we kind of removed all of the things that may get in the way of that therapist providing care. We'd still only have enough therapists for 12% of the people who tried to request a
mm,
session last year.
yeah,
So we have like a massive shortage anyway. And so for me, I kind of look at it like, well, we have a shortage. problem. And then we have people who really maybe would need therapy who won't go. And then we have people who maybe don't need therapy yet, but they are kind of ready to DIY some stuff. Those are the people that are like looking at who they think are experts on TikTok or like going to Reddit and kind of talking about a lot of their problems there. So we have these kind of like categories of people. And what if there's a way for us to just meet them where they're at instead of trying to pull them into therapy where we really can't serve them anyway, you
Hmm.
know? So, and I think in like an ideal future vision world, right, where Swell is in use by millions of everyday people, I kind of see it being more like the tier for people that are not ready for a therapist. So we clear up a little bit more time for people that are. And then, we've also found there are people that are resistant to the idea of therapy, but then they use Swell and then they just kind of become more okay with a lot of concepts, right, that are in there. We're giving them a
Yeah.
lot of insight about themselves through our app too. So it sort of softens up the idea, uh, yeah, for therapy. Also say we escalate and refer. So we have some like risk detection algorithms in our app. So if we can like detect that somebody is struggling, we refer them to a therapist. So we kind of when we started, we went through employers. So we would get therapists kind of concentrated to where those employers are that accepted insurance for those employees, but we'll do that, continue to do that on the consumer side. So for us, we can't replace that. The app will recommend therapy a lot depending on what somebody's there for. But, if you're not in that space or you're not ready for it, we kind of have some alternative earlier solutions.
So I think, sorry, I was just saying, I think it's interesting, this idea of like helping people on the front end who maybe would be resistant to therapy initially. It's kind of like it's a good stepping stone because I know a lot of people in my family who would never sit down with a therapist because it's kind of like voodoo magic anyway. And so it's like, oh, that makes sense. Like it's kind of like giving them the gummy before you have them drink the green smoothie. It's like, here, just start here, and like, and then how, if you can start seeing good outcomes, you can then kind of make the case like, hey, this is just, this is where you need to start, but you got to go from here. So that makes
Absolutely.
sense.
I think there's like a lot of people also think of therapy as you're just talking.
Mm,
Like if you've never been, I think there's a misconception about that. Yeah, on TV, we're just like, how do you feel about that? And that's kind of what people think that is. So they think it's either that or they think it's for people with such severe PTSD they can't kind of cope within their life. And so a lot of therapy should be behavior change. Like if you're wanting to see an outcome in your life, that's going to mean you have to like learn skills and tools to kind of bring that about. And you can do that in therapy with a therapist, but people don't have an example of really what that looks like. So ideally, we can give a small example of that and then refer.
So for me, on one hand, this is, there's an element of personal aspect to this. I mean, although I didn't serve in the military, I know that I have been resistant to therapy in the past. I mean, I'm not resistant now, but there was a point in time where it was like, nope, don't need help. Can't even be fully honest with this person because, if you're going through crisis and you're like, oh, hate this person and want them to die, you're like, am I going to get, a visit from the authorities? Am I going to get put on a 5150 hold because like I'm feeling depressed and just want to sit and like eat Haagen-Dazs and watch like Mad Men all day? Like, don't want to
Sure.
have don't want to have any of those things. So when you think about, the early days of Swell, like starting with the military community and everything, why build for those people? And when I say those people, just like our military are some badasses. And just as someone who I'm a badass myself, I don't really like to ask for help. And so I know that a lot of military people don't ask for help, don't want to. You know, why serve that market?
So I think there's a couple of reasons. One, they're like my people. So almost everyone in my family has served in the military. And or married to it. So part of it's that, if it's just it is my community, and you kind of like start with who you know, and then I was leading product development on a warfighter readiness tool for the Department of Defense with a previous company called Athos, and we were working with SEAL teams on readiness. Readiness in the military is a lot of things. It means ready to deploy, and they're looking at kind of physical readiness, cognitive readiness, like readiness within your family, things like that. And one of the issues was psychological readiness, and there's not a good solution for that. And in doing so many interviews with, with warfighters. And then when I started Swell with like their families as well. Self-reliance is just kind of, that's a thing we're indexing on, particularly for SEALs, but for anybody in the military. Like we need you to kind of have the attitude that you can solve your problems and that, life isn't happening to you. It is happening because of you. And you kind of have to take the reins on that. But when we're indexing on people who are so high on that kind of self-reliant category, those are going to be people who are just not likely to ask for help. And if you look at like death rate in the military, I think this was in 2024. So, well, I'm not sure what it is today, but like in 2024, the majority of all deaths in the military were death by suicide. It was 39. That's kind of like an insane
Wow.
rate. And I think that's a big part of it. It's also just access to the care that's there. And so, yeah. So for me, it started with these are the people who need it the most. They're the people that I know the most. And also, if you can solve this problem for this group, you can probably solve it for a lot of people, right? Like in terms of tough nuts to crack, like that's one of them, right? So that was a lot of it. And we started with we got a TRICARE contract within like 8 months of starting Swell. We did telehealth therapy. And we did, all of that was a really important precursor. Because if you could think about when we're starting the company, it's like late 2022. I think ChatGPT had just announced, OpenAI had just announced, AI. But a lot of the kind of like algorithmic systems that we were using were very new and something that we really didn't want to create a bunch of risk for people, right? Like, I don't want to provide a self-guided solution that might harm someone or not detect if someone's really at risk. So we started with, being able to provide therapy first and then building this on after. And yeah, that was kind of why I guess it's a lot of things. The other thing I'll say too is just on the self-guided angle. I mean, I talked to hundreds of warfighters. So that was so compelling to them. This idea of if you tell me what to do, I'll do it. But if I have to go to a therapist, I
Hmm.
won't. Even though a therapist might be able to help
Interesting.
me find what to do, that just seemed like such a barrier.
Hmm.
And I kind of felt like we've done so much work in our culture over the last decade and trying to destigmatize mental health and get people to like go walk through the door. But some people are just not going to do it. And so there's something to be said about reducing stigma and pulling them in, but there's also something to be said about meeting people where they are, right? And if that's something that they don't feel comfortable doing, what's a middle step, right? Like we can't just accept that this is going to be the outcome, right? That we're going to have like people who are dying by suicide, who are never seeing a therapist, who are never being diagnosed with a mental health condition, right? Like there's got to be something more we can do in between. So yeah, it's kind of those were the initial reasons, if you will.
Is there a range of people that you're getting into Swell or targeting at all, or does it skew widely?
It skews pretty widely. It's like 18 is the youngest, although that's more rare, up to like 45. It seems to be it was mostly people in their 20s, but that's not really true anymore. So yeah, like 20s, 30s, up to 45.
Okay.
And then also, we started with military, but then we branched into law enforcement. There's some overlap there, and so did law enforcement and their families. And then we launched consumer. So we only launched consumer like a month and a half ago. And then we have a couple hundred users now that just have found the app and downloaded it and used it. So
Huh.
the kinds of people that we're helping, are going to continue to grow and evolve.
Do you see I mean, it's early to tell. Do you see that consumer market becoming like the larger share of who Swell will eventually service the most? Or I mean, like I said, it's early. Maybe you don't know. Do you have any projections on if that'll overtake what you've done up to this point previously?
I hope that it will, right? I want Swell to be available for everyone. Also, service members are consumers too. Like
Right.
military spouses are consumers too. And so, yeah, I hope that it will. That is the goal. And also, I think gaps that keep people from getting access to care or make them maybe resistant to talking to a therapist, those exist over like a whole lot of spectrums. I think military is one of them, but there's others too. There's like a lot of economic barriers for people that we can help too. So we really hope that we've built it to be for everyone. We've just kind of like built it with these really specific people first. And so it gets really tailored and targeted to like you and your job and these like things about you. But ideally, like the kind of systems underneath should be the same for any, you know, kind of highly self-reliant person.
Have you guys branched into like firefighting and that and medical professionals too?
Only briefly, like we have one fire department that we have a pilot with, but yeah, fire and EMS were part of our kind of like first responder push that started last October.
Many times, especially like in the area of healthcare, but specifically like mental health, it's reactive. Like something breaks, something happens, this event happens, this series of events happen, and then the treatment happens after. Swell seems like it's built more on prevention.
Mhm.
And so what does that look like on a day-to-day basis?
So I will say, to be fair, everything, even prevention, is reactive to some degree, right? Like we're not kind of reaching people in the womb. There's a lot that's happened to all of us, you
That's
know,
that's the last
Well,
stage.
babies.
but
Ultrasound therapy.
so to kind of like give you an idea of how it works. So if you guys were all to like download the app right now, so we have this proprietary archetyping engine. So we basically take there's you, and we have 63 traits that like might make up who you are. And those traits can be anything from, like how social or like your social battery, if you kind of tend to recharge by yourself or with other people. That's kind of a traditional kind of personality trait that a lot of like engines use. But then to things a little bit more specific. So like locus of control, that idea of like, life is happening to me and my life is kind of in the whims of like fate, right? Versus life is happening because of me and I'm responsible for every outcome. And so each of these traits, you get like there's 6 positions across those traits where a person can be. And when you come into the app, we kind of archetype you over time. So we do a lot of quizzes and get to what your placement is kind of in each of these traits. And then from there, we are able to predict patterns that you're kind of likely to exhibit both in your life personally and then also with other people, especially depending on what their traits are. So we have a feature in the app called connections where you can basically, so like Yemi and Aram, you could add each other. And let's say Yemi has like a collection of traits that make him really likely to, let's say when there's an argument, Yemi, you tend to like you need to resolve that argument, right? So like if an argument has happened between you and Aram, let's say Aram is like, I just want, once things are escalated, like I don't want to talk anymore, I shut down. And then let's say you, Yami, are, I have to resolve this and like I kind of can't let it go until it's resolved, right? That's like a pursue
Mhm,
withdraw dynamic. So
mhm,
like when you're feeling a potential risk to the relationship, Yemi, you pursue. And Aram, when you're feeling a potential risk to the relationship, you withdraw. And so we can kind of predict that you might be a pursuer, and then we might predict that Aram might be a withdrawer. And so
yeah,
that doesn't mean that that dynamic will unfold between the two of you, but it means it might possibly. And so we have a lot of dynamics like that we can both capture between two people, but also with you and yourself and kind of how you move through your life. And so when you enter into the app and you kind of like start doing all of these things and you set goals, which can be really broad from like, I really want to work out, but I can't make myself do it, to really specific. Like, I want to stop fighting about household chores all the time with my partner, right? It can be either of those things. We'll take these patterns that we now have predicted are likely to happen with
sure.
you and with these other people and can kind of leverage that to help give you really specific feedback of what you might interrupt and change. So that's something you would get if you were to be in therapy with a therapist. Like you get to know them over time, they get to learn these things about you, and then they can kind of give you advice and trial and error it. But that's sort of how we do that. And so when you enter in, it's preventative in that if you think about couples therapy is a really good example, a lot of people don't go until they are kind of done, right? Or near done with the relationship. And that's when they want to go. But this might be something where you just really are frustrated after a fight that you've had tonight and you want some sort of relief for it. And you like download the app, you start using it, your partner starts using it. And we can kind of uncover some of these dynamics and work on them together. And that might be so helpful for you that you do say, well, wow, I would love a couples therapist, or wow, I'd love to work on these kind of other things in myself.
That's really cool that you're talking about like being able to have multiple users, spouses, partners, and that be able to communicate like that on the app because I think there is an interesting reactive stigma towards this type of stuff, particularly in couples counseling. I remember I had someone that I knew was very successful. They had a very, very good relationship. And they had been going to weekly counseling for years. And it's like people always ask us, like, oh, like what's wrong with you and Julie? Are you guys okay? And it's like, no, it's like, we go to counseling because we have a great relationship. And he's like, and like, we like that it's going to
Want to
stay
keep
that
one.
way. Right.
Yeah.
It's like, and I remember hearing them being like, oh, yeah, that makes sense. Like, what a novel idea. It's not like, oh yeah, we're on the brink of divorce, so we're gonna hop into therapy real quick. It's like, no, it's like, we have a great relationship. We just want it to stay that way. No, that's
Absolutely.
cool.
And it would be great if everybody, I think, viewed it that way and went to couples therapy. But also, there's the other elements of like it not really being affordable for a lot of people. Most couples therapists don't take insurance. Insurance tends to reimburse less for couples therapy. So there's a lot of reasons why people may not do that. And so I also kind of view this as like it's a path to get a lot of these insights. It's not everything, it's a little bit different. It's always going to be your interpretation and their interpretation and whatever we can glean from that. And a therapist is going to be really skilled at being able to watch you interact and kind of maybe draw more conclusions. But we don't have to solve everything, right? We're not trying to replace therapy. We're just trying to get people like help where we can. And so there are a lot of things that we kind of can do early.
Good.
Very good.
Segueing from all the social constructs, and I was curious on how you went from being a social worker to starting your own app. How did you go about that process and navigating?
Yeah. So I was a social worker at the very beginning of my career and a lot happened. So I think if you would have asked me when I was like a teenager what I was going to do with my life, one, I was going to be a musician. I'm still a musician today. I'm never gonna, it's going to happen at some point, but that's just going to be like act number 6. I don't know.
Did you know this about her, Yemi? I didn't know
No
she was a
idea.
musician.
No, what
Okay,
what do you
wow.
play?
A few instruments. I play the guitar.
All right,
The
all
things I
right.
still play well. We'll talk about it later.
Next awesome retreat, I'm gonna make sure they give you like a mini concert space. So
Oh, it's fine. We could do a band. There's a
that'd
lot
be
of
so
people
cool.
actually. A lot of
I play
founders play
bass.
music.
That's
See?
good.
But yeah, I also had like whatever entrepreneurship thing is there when you're young was there. But it didn't feel like a desire to be an entrepreneur. It just felt like a desire to survive. And then you kind of come up with like creative ways to do that. Like, we didn't grow up with money. We were like always, just kind of always struggling. I was like raised by a single mom. We had a lot of financial troubles. Like, there was like a brief period where we were homeless for a while. And so when I say we didn't have money, it was like I think to a like there's always a threat of like we're not going to have electricity, we're not going to have food, we're not going to have kind of these like things. And when you grow up like that, it does kind of feel like everyone's responsibility, right? And so it felt like my responsibility too. And so I was just always trying to find ways to make money, like when I was a kid, and got really good at, at finding novel ways to make money. Like when MySpace came out, I started like figuring out how to make custom MySpace layouts. So then I, made them for friends and then I sold them at school. And then I figured out how you could make like a website that could generate layouts for you when you so I like let people select
Wow.
their colors and buttons and playlists and would kind of like generate a layout, made some money that way. Had a few kind of like eBay endeavors, things like this when I was like a teenager. And then I was a social worker. And then my mom became sick, which she survived. She's totally good. She's great. But yeah, she was sick. She had cancer. I made very little money as a social worker. And yet again, it was like, we needed to like have more resources at our disposal. So I took a sales job. And I think when I took that job, I was like actually still a social worker, which is crazy because I was working 80 hours a week. So I'm not sure how I did that. But yeah, I worked in sales. I ended up getting good at sales, kind of worked my way up in that organization. And then I started my own competitive company because that sounds bad, but the rates that we did credit card processing and we would quote small businesses at like 1.5%. And then
Wow. Okay.
that would be true for like a month. And then they would like jack it up to like 6%. And I felt really, really bad when I discovered this. So
Wait,
Amazing.
why is this so
my,
funny? I'm so confused on why you're dying.
Well,
Like
it's
that
like
wasn't that
it's like
funny.
a
This is
it's like
cruel.
no, it's
it
like
is.
2.9%. is like the standard processing
Yeah.
fee. So it's like get everybody in the door at half the cost, and then we'll recoup all the loss and a couple. That's
And
hysterical.
they were in
I
these
love that.
contracts, these really expensive thousands of dollar contracts. And so I felt really bad. But by this point, I'd made all of this money, right? Like I was selling machines, smart cards were coming out, like the ones with the chips. Anyway, so I made all this money, but I felt
Great.
really guilty. So I start my own credit card processing company. I like found out who the processor for Walmart was in my town. And I was like, could I get an umbrella deal for all these small businesses? And then I bought all of these businesses out of their contracts and like moved them, into this new company. But now we made no money. We were making like $3, $4
So
like
amazing.
per
So
business. It was like nothing.
you were like a vigilante
Yeah.
against your former position.
Yeah. That was my that was my foray into owning a
That's so
business.
great.
Yeah. And
So
then
great.
but then, I did need to make money. Obviously, we like arrived back here again. This is always the way the world goes around, I guess. And so I started doing web design because back then it was like I think like 3,000 was about what it would cost for someone to build you a website, like a basic WordPress website. And Squarespace and stuff didn't really exist yet. And so I did subscriptions where people would pay between $100 and $200 a month, and I would like build and manage them a website. And ended up growing that to like a couple $100,000 a year, which was more money than I'd ever imagined in my life. And then somewhere in this time, I like moved to Nashville, and Lyft had started the rideshare company. And I think Nashville was like, that was one of their first 20 cities. And I don't remember exactly where they were kind of like in the startup phase of the company. But I want to say it was like late 2014, early 2015. And I met some of the founding team in Nashville. So I go to Soulshine Pizza Factory, which is this live jazz place, and I end up running into the like marketing team and some other people on the founding team at Lyft, and they were like doing some sort of driver activation event, and we got to talking about marketing and then their trust and safety issues, and I had this social work background, and so I end up joining Lyft to start their trust and safety team in their first like ancillary office in Nashville. And so that was kind of my foray into startups. And I sold the company that I had. And by sold, that's an interesting thing we can talk about at another time because it's actually kind of hard to sell things when you don't know what you're doing. But I sold the company that I that I had sort of, and went to work for them, making very little money. But I was like, I didn't know what I was doing. I'd kind of gotten it to the company to where I could grow it. And I knew that I wanted to do something more meaningful again. Like there was a reason why I was a social worker before. And credit card processing, again, this was like a vigilante effort. This was not my like life's passion. And so, yeah, I wanted to learn from people who knew how to like really truly make something from nothing. And did that, was with them through their growth phase and their like IPO, stayed for I think like a year or two after that. And then I went to, by that point I had kind of like moved into engineering and product. I had the technical background, but it was all self-taught before. So I kind of started in operations and then moved there. And then I like led product development at an epidemiology company, and then I led product development at a defense tech company, both kind of in the healthcare space. And then was like, you know what? Now is the time. Like I feel like I have the skills that I need to do this work. And when I had been a social worker before, the thing that was so magical about tech when I finally moved into it was like I'm putting all this effort into one person. And for anybody who's ever worked in like case management, it's like you have this person who desperately wants to change their life, but has none of the really like tools to do so, and so much is kind of working against them. And trying to make change for this person is just like trying to run through waist deep water for like
Mm,
months on end, and you pour everything you have sometimes, and you just can't really control the outcome. And the really cool thing about Lyft was like I put in all of this work and effort and blood, sweat, and tears, and then I affect millions of people.
yeah.
And that's really incredible that you can do that.
Hmm.
And so it kind of bridged a gap for me too, in terms of like mental health and what's possible, you know?
That's awesome. It's funny having met you through the Awesome Fellowship a few years back. I knew that you had been with the team at Lyft at some point because like the things that we list on our info sheets. But having heard about all of your other expansive experience, I forgot. And I was like, oh yeah, you started talking about Lyft. I was like, I forgot you started on Lyft. I just didn't realize how much else you had going on in those days. That's crazy. Talking about the economics real quickly, because I'm sure people would be curious about this. You've raised, Yemi mentioned about 1.7 million in funding at this point. A couple of questions I'm going to kind of like roll into one here. First would be, What was that like? Because I know a little bit. I remember when you were just past a like major portion of time where you were attempting to get funding, and you had pitched a bunch of times, and you were like
It
just
failed.
past that. It was like a
Yeah.
long process, right? So I'm curious, was the length of time it took to get good funding, was that primarily based on it being in the mental health space? Is that just like a category that investors don't generally like? And then tied in with that, what has the experience been since you've come to Louisville and you're building the company here in the Midwest? I always like to talk to people in the software space about building it here as opposed to, being on the coast. So yeah, however you want to kind of tackle those two things, I think that would be something listeners would be interested in.
So I think the timing was like a few things. There was just really truly shit timing in that like Silicon Valley Bank died right
Mm,
before we were trying
right,
to raise, and then interest rates increase. I didn't really understand how venture works, but it's not always that a lot of rich people put money into a fund and then it's just sitting there ready for people to write
right.
checks out of.
Yep.
It's like a lot of times they're having to kind of go and get authorization and then they wire. Anyway, that whole thing, it's like it's just changed. It's like the risk assessment for an investor definitely changed during that time. And the upside of like, I could put money into these really safe vehicles because of what interest rates being what they are. So a lot of people just kind of didn't invest in venture as much for like about 2 years. So that was happening. And then the other thing, mental health had like a big heyday in like 2021. That's when like BetterHelp got funded,
Yeah.
Talkspace. I think they maybe went public in 2021, 2022 around then. So there was just so much capital being poured into all of these like telehealth competitors, and they all die because you can't outspend BetterHelp on ads. And so when they're all trying to do the same thing of like build these therapy marketplaces, a lot of people who really agreed with the mission of making mental health care accessible had like put all of this money in there and then lost all of it. So when you go to investors, you can find people who are kind of like mission aligned. You can find people who really want to be in that space. There's like lots of kind of ways in
Mhm.
to find the investor that's like right for you or the venture firm that's right for you. And those were just really not writing checks. So it was kind of bad timing. The other thing that was bad timing that's funny to think of now, because now everybody wants to invest in defense tech. It was like a red flag that I remember. So we got this TRICARE contract, which by the way, quick side story on this TRICARE contract. So it took 8 months from the time I started the company until I had a contract in hand. And during
Okay.
those 8 months, I think it maybe took me like 3 months of hard work to like get the contract. And it involved, I called like 40 people at TRICARE. I couldn't get anybody to return my calls. I ended up like seeing on C-SPAN, I think it was like Marsha Blackburn. And it was something with the Defense Reparations Committee and the suicide rate with TRICARE. And anyway, there was this big argument that was happening that I saw. And so I finally like called her office and was like, there's this problem. I want to solve this. I can't get anybody to like return my calls. And, I've been months like at this. And someone from her office put me in touch with someone from Human and Military who put me in touch with someone from TRICARE. And boom, I had a contract. And for what it's worth, people take years. Like I know people today that are like 4 or 5 years in trying to get any kind of like government or insurance contract. It's just like really hard and it takes a long
Hmm.
time. And so this should have been like an impressive thing. Anyway, but people thought like the government isn't a safe enough bet. Like that's just one customer. What happens if they change their mind? What happens if something else happens? We had some SBIRs like in the works that were like all kind of through the defense tech chain. Most VCs had never invested in companies that pursued non-dilutive funding and really like knew what that process looked like. And so that was a really big risk to people. So that made it hard. And then the other thing was just I think just like learning how like investing works and like who has money and who doesn't and how you can tell. That's probably why it took so long. The other thing was revenue is like the only thing that actually matters for a startup. And I think 10 years ago, that wasn't like positioned as being true. I think like 10 years ago, and even now it's funny. There's like all of these founders I run into that have an idea and they've been sitting on this idea for like 3 years and they can't get anybody to give them any money. And they can't get anybody to them any money because they don't have a product and they don't have any customers. And those fake, like invisible customers haven't given them money. And so you're asking someone to like take this risk on you. And so we had like revenue, but it was really small. I think we'd had like $40,000 in ARR at the time. And so that was another thing that happened too. It's like, I just kind of like, we ran out of money. We had no more runway. I couldn't get investment. And so the thing I could do was get more revenue. And so then I got us to, I think, like 175K in ARR over the course of like 3 or 4 months. And then then we had a problem where we couldn't keep onboarding customers because the percentage of, or the time it would take for TRICARE to reimburse us was too long, and the cost to onboard those customers and connect them with therapists was too long. And so, and I couldn't get anybody to give me a short-term loan because we hadn't been around for more than 2 years. And so then I went and renegotiated the TRICARE contract, which, as it turns out, is a thing you can do. And so all these things I kind of did, like get more revenue, renegotiate the contract, made it an easier thing for people to say yes to. And then the other thing that helped is I had been talking to investors who saw me struggle to raise and were waiting for us to die for like a year and a half. And we did. And so there's something to be said about that too. Like one of our, like our biggest investor is Defy VC. And that was one of the things that Neil, the like head of their firm, had said. It's like a lot of people kind of complain about not being able to raise capital and then they die. And he really doesn't think that I'm ever going to quit, and I'm not. And so it's
Yeah.
like that's a big part of why people will kind of invest in you, you know?
Love it.
Yeah. And then in terms of in Louisville, or like I think raising capital in the Midwest is probably harder. I think growing a company today is just as easy as it is on the coast. About 2 years ago, it was really difficult to get technical talent. We don't need as much technical talent now because of AI. So that's not like as big of a challenge. So I think you get a lot of like cost savings for being here. And I also think that there is money in the Midwest. There's money everywhere. And the reason why you hear that there's not is because there just aren't investable companies here. So in SF, there's maybe, you know, 10,000, not 10,000, but maybe 1,000 investable companies, right? And there's maybe 10,000 others that are trying and can't get money, but you see all the success stories of the 1,000. And here you're only seeing maybe like 5 success stories, and you think, well, there's no money here, but there's only 5 investable companies here, you know? And then we have like hundreds of companies that aren't. And part of that, I think, comes from when you are on the coast, you probably have had more. It's more likely that you would have worked for Lyft. It's more likely that you would have worked for Slack. It's more likely that you would have worked for one of these companies that's like become successful in the last decade. And so because of that, you have probably more money, more exposure, and more experience in like grinding it out and doing what it takes to kind of make a company successful. And people in Louisville, Lexington, and Kentucky, we haven't had those big wins. And so a lot of people don't have that experience. It's like, you may have worked at Humana for the last 10 years, and that's a very different environment where you wait and ask a lot. And that's kind of the opposite of the mentality that there needs to be for a startup. So I think that there's that too. It is hard to find people who have the right mentality to make a company successful here. It's harder to find that than it is on the coast. It was a lot to answer. Sorry.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's a loaded question. So that makes sense. I mean, there are a number of factors going in there.
We did, when we finished our raise, I think I'd talked to over 330 investors by the end. One day I'm going to go back and look at how many actually had money versus how many wasted my time knowing that they didn't. And I wasted my own time not knowing how to ask. My audacity grew the like longer I did that.
By like 275, you're like, hey, real quick, before we get started, do you guys have any dry powder, or can I just go to the next meeting?
Exactly. Yeah. Because you feel rude or something at first. Yeah, that happened. I also stopped like letting people do really rude things. So like, it was so funny. I remember a couple of times early on where like you get into a meeting and then like there's 2 people there and they're both on their phone while you're pitching, which is just so rude. You know, it's like, you don't care to be here. And I have better like things to do, you know? And somewhere along the way, and I have like a mentor that kind of helps me with this too, but somewhere along the way, I realized that like VCs are not putting value into the world like entrepreneurs are. Like if you're a founder, you are creating value where there used to not be. And that VC is only going to have success by your efforts, by your labor, right? And so you have a lot of value in this equation. And if they don't care or they don't have like want to give you the time and attention, like it is more valuable. It's more worth your time to go like do things that are going to get your company revenue, to go do things that are going to add that value. In my case, I would think about like how many more people we could serve, like how many more people could be benefiting from Swell, but aren't, because I've spent like 60 hours this week working on fundraising. And around the time that I said, like, I'd rather do something valuable and do that, I poured that effort into the company became more successful, and then it turned around to now the right VCs wanted to talk to me and were respectful of my time. So it's kind of a two-way street. Like you do have to like suck it up and go talk to people who are rude to you. But you also get to a point where you earn enough credibility and you know it and you have more audacity and you know what the relationship here is, and you let people get away with less and they respect it. That's another thing. I won't say their name on this podcast because people would know, but there is a VC that notoriously talks to founders for months and then never writes checks. Like they don't write any checks. And they came into our round. And what was funny is like by the time we got to the end where they'd said yes, they said yes, and then they kept trying to move the date. And I, at this point, was just so over it. I was like, where I don't remember, like December 12th or something. I was like, it's December 12th. This is the date. All checks are coming in on this date. All this like discussion about who's going to wire first. No, on this date, everybody wires. That's what's happening. And so then the date got closer and they were like, well, we have some money in a CD, which is the stupidest thing I've ever heard from a firm that has like millions of dollars. Anyway, we have some money in a CD. We're going to move around. Like, would you be okay with it this date? Would you be? And I just said, no, I would not. Like if it's that, it's like it's shit or get off the pot. Like put the money in, then that's when everybody else is putting the money in. And at this point, I was so convinced they probably weren't going to invest despite all the yeses because of everything that I'd heard that, yeah, I was just like not gonna dick around. So, and that
Get the hell off
attitude,
my yawn.
yeah, but it makes a difference too. Like I feel like that attitude may have been like part of, I don't know, it changes the relationship in a way that makes people more willing to invest. I'm not saying you should pull like a Sam Bankman fraud and like go sleep on a couch while investors come in, but like, just knowing who has the like some of the power there, and don't waste their time, be respectful to them, but you can expect the same back. And I think it helps you weed out and find the right investors too.
All right, Rachel. Well, first of all, I want to thank you for joining, for being here with us. Also, where can we find you? Obviously, you can find the app in the App Store, or you can go to getswell.app. Where else?
Yeah, you can find me on LinkedIn. I write for this like startup newsletter called The Distill, which you can find and follow. I'll post that on my LinkedIn so people can like find it easily. I also write for my own Substack secretly that I think nobody knows about, but Yemi commented on it recently, and I was like, dear God, people find it.
Yemi's a sleuth. Awesome.
But yeah, LinkedIn, Rachel Edenfield. It's Edenfield. Find me there. Eventually, I'll have more of a social presence. Probably when I have to fundraise again.
Awesome. Well, Rachel, I appreciate you coming in. Everything that you're doing with Swell is good stuff, and I'm excited about that consumer division because, again, I don't need mental health, but if I did, I would download Swell and use it. So,
I'll give you all free codes to not use.
for us to not use.
I don't have
Yes.
to know about it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's awesome. Yeah. Thanks so much, Rachel. It's a lot of fun.
Thanks. It was a lot of
Absolutely.
fun.
It was great talking to you
Awesome.
guys.
You as well.
Cheers.
Cheers.
See ya.